Hey everyone, Dr. Z. I thought I'd do an update video about the COVID thing. So before I did a video talking about how I'd gotten COVID for the first time during the whole pandemic in the last month. And that video got a lot of comments, people telling stories about, oh, this was my experience with COVID, or I hadn't gotten COVID either, and here's my symptoms now. And there was a lot of similarities, actually. And one of the interesting things that people really focused in on was this weird sense of like, disequilibrium, like it's kind of hard to describe, but something's not quite right. And the way I described it's not so much a brain fog, it's like a body fog. Like the whole body feels just a little bit off. So I was getting better by about, day 5, I think I made that video. I forget exactly. By day 7, the symptoms started getting worse. It was really interesting. So this is the kind of the follow-up. So around day 7, I was suddenly like, oh, I'm coughing more. I'm more tired. And I have that sense of body fog, like a little, you can't even really call it dizziness. It's a strange disequilibrium. Things are like almost like vertigo a little bit. And I was like, what the hell? And so I reached in my closet and pulled out my $10 Amazon oxygen sat. This was in the morning of day 7 of the COVID infection. And I was like, oh, let me just see, I just thought it'd be funny to see like what my O2 sat was. I figured it'd be, 98% like it always is. And I look at it and it starts out at like, it's having trouble getting a signal because it's a $10 piece of crap. Then when it does get a signal, it says 95. And by the way, while this is happening, like I'm just not feeling great. So I watched this thing. This is just a classic example of what not to do. I watched this cheap piece of crap measure my O2 sat, and the O2 sat starts dropping from 95, 92, 90. Now it's blinking as a warning. 80, 83. And my pulse is going from like my normal of 50, 60 up to like 110, 120. And I'm watching this, and the whole time now, in addition to the weird sensations, day 7 of COVID, I start having this panic sensation. Like, oh, like it really felt like, oh, so this is how you die. Like you've thrown a big blood clot, and this is what you're seeing on the O2 sat. And it felt like, oh my God, like I had to lay down. I was so lightheaded. And this, all of this points to the biopsychosocial aspects of COVID, of every illness. Biological, like, yeah, you were infected with this thing, right? But I mean, how many man flus have I had? How many, I had mono when I was in college and it felt terrible for a month, like feels like you're dying, but you don't have the whole years of conditioning, like, oh, COVID can kill you in all these ways. You don't have the fact that you did 23andMe like an idiot and found out that you have these 2 clotting gene, heterozygous clotting tendencies, factor V Leiden and prothrombin. So already you're going in with all the reports and talking about COVID for so many years about how it does cause an increased risk of blood clotting, and vascular inflammation and all this other stuff. And so going in with all that psychological stuff and all the social stuff, like all the people talking about, oh yeah, this happens and this happens. And then of course, seeing the stuff in the hospital, you're armed like with all this conditioning. Then these symptoms happen. Now, like if this were mono and I didn't have all that conditioning, like I felt so much worse when I had mono than I did with COVID. But yet COVID has this biopsychosocial matrix that's very different than mono, because mono, it's like, yeah, you're probably going to get better if you don't rupture your spleen or end up dying of, some kind of lymphoma later from the Epstein-Barr. That's controversial. That all said, here I am looking at this crappy, little made in China $10 thing from Amazon, like a throwaway Temu product, telling me that my SAT is 80 and my pulse is 120, and feeling in the body like I'm going to die. So it actually went through my mind. I'm like, okay, I should tell my wife because I'm at home. She's working from home today. I should tell her I wonder if I should call 911 because I feel absolutely like I'm going to die. Like there was, the classic thing they talk about, this impending sense of doom when you have a pulmonary embolism or some big catastrophe like a leaking aneurysm or a big myocardial infarction, a heart attack. There's this classic sort of thing that they talk about where people will say, I have an impending sense of doom, like I'm going to die. And it's the body kind of, responding to this catastrophe. It felt like that. Day 7. Like I was like, I'm going to die. So I get my wife over there. I call her, I'm laying on the couch and I'm like, look at this thing. And she's looking at it, reading this thing. And she's like, yeah, it's probably just not reading it right. And I'm like, but I feel terrible. And she's looking at me and like in retrospect, it was clear. It was like she could see the signs of, panic. And listen, like I'm an adept meditator, been doing all this shit for so many years. All that goes out the window when you actually feel like you're going to die. When existential terror hits, there's like a primal drive to survive that kicks in and it triggers this huge physiologic response. So all that stuff kind of goes into the background, all that like awareness of awareness and watching these things unfold and knowing that, it's all just this. It doesn't matter. You're just like, I'm going to fucking die. Like my kids are going to have no dad. Like that's what it feels like. And again, like because of all this conditioning, right? So I'm looking at this thing. She's looking at this thing. She's like, well, listen, I'll tell you what, maybe don't look at this thing. Let's recheck it on a different finger. You relax. I'll look at it. You don't look at it. And I'm not even going to tell you what it is, but I'll tell you that if I think you need to call 911. So she watches this thing and she's like, I think you're okay. Why don't you just stay here, relax, etc. And so I'm starting to like calm down a little bit. But then I say, well, okay, gosh, I'm just going to talk to some of my buddies, on the phone because maybe they can talk me down because this feels like panic. And I don't get panic like that. Like I don't get panic attacks, but this felt like what people describe as like an actual panic attack. So I call one of my friends and we have this wonderful conversation and I'd been going through actually a fair bit of like some stressful stuff. So I was like, maybe it's some of that and maybe it's some of this and plus the COVID and, triggering some real physiologic stuff that is showing up as this thing. And this O2 sat is garbage. It's really not useful. So for the rest of the day, I kind of stay home. But I got stuff to do. Like I got to take my kid to her camp. There's like, cause my wife is working and I was like, do I do this? And I was like, I feel better. So I did that. But then I came to the studio and then I started having these symptoms again. I was like, God, I feel terrible. Like, what is this? And there's this deep uncertainty. Like, okay, could I have some complication, COVID pneumonia? But I'm not having fevers, but the vital signs are crazy. I'm feeling my pulse. It's high, but what's that? Is that panic? I don't have that cheap O2 sat with me. And I'm like, what the fuck? So I talk to another friend just to kind of ground myself. I'm like, okay. So, and you look, I should know better than all this, right? But all this conditioning, right? And the actual physiologic effects of having COVID infection, which I do think now, especially looking back, like it has a real, almost unique kind of, mental effect, this virus. And people can weigh in the comments and tell me what you think, because people who've had COVID, they can weigh in on what this is like. And again, it's biopsychosocial. So some of it is the social conditioning, all the news and all that, and the psychology around that, and then the actual virus. So I don't feel great, but then I feel a little better and I'm like, all right. So that night I go to bed. The next day, I still am not feeling great. Like I'm really tired. I go see my buddy and we're supposed to like lift weights and I haven't done any exercise since I first got infected, and he had COVID just recently. So we felt very comfortable. And by the way, I was still testing positive. That's the other thing. Like 7 days in, I was still testing positive. So I was like, that was more psychological stuff. So at this point, it's so funny too. Like how much have I talked about COVID and then have this happen? It's in a sense, you could say it's purely humiliating and very shameful. And there was that going through my mind at that time, because I remember thinking, if I die of COVID now because I don't follow up on this, it's going to be humiliating. Like that was one of the things that actually passed, because we're humans, right? So this is how we function. We're social creatures. We're like, what will people think if I die of COVID? It's so funny. And so the next day I'm still not feeling great, but the panic is gone. So that could, because I'd really kind of sat with that. I'd sat in meditation. I was like, okay, I see where the fear, the panic, and the psychological aspect is. So what's left? Just symptoms in the body, just the energetics of what I'm feeling. And then there's some thought process like, okay, so what is the differential for this? Like, could I have myocarditis? Could I have a pulmonary embolism? Could I have COVID pneumonia? Could this just be viral effect? And it happens with many viruses, and just I'm not usually so attuned to it or psychologically biased in a certain direction as to the possibilities. So there's kind of like this sort of Bayesian inference of, oh, what's likely and what can I sort of look at when I'm thinking of the differential. And as that goes on, I'm still having these episodes of this really indescribable disequilibrium, no real shortness of breath, but a kind of a sense of like extreme fatigue that comes on where I have to like sit down. And this doesn't happen to me, right? And I started thinking, people get postural orthostatic tachycardia syndrome from COVID. They get dysautonomia, where the sort of nervous system response to sitting up and different postural changes is overpronounced. And this has been documented, especially with patients with long COVID. A good percentage of them have this POTS syndrome, POTS syndrome. And I thought, well, maybe it's some component of that. Like, I don't know what it is. And then something just clicked and I said, I'm still having symptoms. It's the uncertainty aspect that's making it strange. And part of this feeling of like kind of a little bit of shame was, I'm a doctor. I know better. I would tell a patient if they had these symptoms, they should go get checked out, actually go to see their primary or go to urgent care or at least contact somebody. So why is the standard different for me, right? So I talked to my wife and she's like, yeah, let's go. We'll go into the urgent care where, in the clinic where you used to work and let them check you out. And she agreed because she was like, yeah, something's not right. So this is where it got really interesting. So I went to the urgent care and I told them my symptoms. And I said, I'm a physician and this is what I'm concerned about is I do have these clotting disorders, and then I was getting better and now I feel quite a bit worse. And there's this disequilibrium, and at home my O2 sat is measuring crazy, but I think that thing's not reliable. And they said, cool, okay, yeah, come in. They had space, put me in a room, checked my vitals. The vitals were fine. The O2 sat was 100%, right, when I was sitting in the chair. And they drew some blood. They took an EKG. The EKG was stone cold normal, unchanged from years ago, what I recall, just sinus arrhythmia, which is, where the pulse changes when you take a breath in and breathe out. And so all fine. And then the doctor comes in and we have a nice conversation. She was great. And I said, well, let's just try something. I'm going to stand up from sitting on the exam table with the O2 sat on, and let's just see what happens. So I stood up and I look at the O2 sat on their fancy meter, and it's like 100%. And then it goes beep, 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 and it starts dropping until it gets to 83%. And I'm standing there watching it. I'm watching it while this is happening, right? And I'm like, well, there you go. And I'm feeling this kind of like weirdness. And she's like, oh, okay. Well, I think that I don't know what that is, because the minute I sat down, it normalized. Now this just gets vaguely mysterious, right? So again, the differential diagnosis is this broad thing of all, blood clot, pneumonia, myocarditis would be a little weird, but like, bronchitis. There's all kinds of stuff that could be causing a low O2 sat. But looking at the oxygen meter shouldn't cause a low O2 sat, because unless you're really clamping down, like you're panicking, clamping down your vascular flow, and maybe that's altering the dynamics a little, but still it's pretty unusual. So she's like, okay, I think we should do a CT, a CAT scan of your chest with an angiogram. So they inject contrast, called a CT angio, to rule out pulmonary embolism, a clot. It'll look at pneumonia, look at the lung parenchyma, look at the big heart vessels, different things like that. So there's different things that it can see. So, for me, I'm always weighing like, okay, so there's radiation exposure from that. That's, it's not a big deal, but it's not trivial. It's, not something you would just do. I think, my radiology buddy said it's the equivalent of like living on Earth for a year is the radiation exposure from a CT chest angio. So if I didn't have to do it, I didn't want to do it. And there's a second risk from CT angio, which is the contrast. So they give you this contrast that can show you the sort of the contrast between the blood vessels, and it's a long story, but it allows you to see at the blood vessel level to look for clots and things like that. That's why they call it a CT angiogram, because you're actually looking at the blood vessels, right? So that can cause, in rare instances, kidney trouble, kidney failure, acute renal failure, through a variety of mechanisms. And it can also cause an allergy. So you can find out you're allergic to this thing. So I'd never had this before. So I thought, well, I think it's worth it just to put this whole blood clot thing to rest. They could have done a lower extremity ultrasound to see if I had lower extremity clots, but we decided, we'll be able to look at lung parenchyma too and see if there's pneumonia or something and all that. And we just skipped over the chest x-ray and my wife was with me and she's a chest radiologist. And she's like, I just do the CT angio. You'll see what you need to see. So I said, okay, that's fine. As long as you hydrate afterwards, that risk is very small if you don't have pre-existing kidney disease. So I said, fine. So I go down there. They sit me in the scanner. This was the first time I'd had a CT with contrast, and I've had a coronary calcium study years ago, and I actually live streamed that one. And it was interesting. You have to hold your breath, and the more you can breathe in, the better the quality is, and you stay still and so on. And so I was able to do that with no trouble, no shortness of breath, nothing. And that's a good sign. And so they said, oh yeah, the quality of the study is really pristine. And my buddy was actually working in radiology, my med school buddy that day, and gave me the cheat notes and said, look, your CT scan looks like you have the lungs of like a 20-year-old. You don't even have ground glass. You don't have there's nothing. They're totally clear. There's no evidence of pulmonary embolism. The coronary vessels we can see don't even have calcium in them. Like everything looks pristine. And they did, however, scan down a little into the abdomen, and they saw some fat stranding around the celiac and hepatic arteries. And sometimes that can signal inflammation or vasculitis. And sometimes COVID can cause that. I wasn't having a lot of GI symptoms, but that was interesting, right? So that was it. That was the findings. So I go back and I put on the O2 sat, and I don't look at the monitor. And I have my wife look at it, and she's like, yeah, it's 100 the whole time. I'm standing up. I started doing squats. I did all this shit to try to provoke it, and nothing changed. Like it was still 100 when I don't look at it. And I didn't even bother looking. And then later I was like, well, let me look at it. But I think even the assumption that it could be abnormal was gone because the CT was negative, right? Now, there could have been something like we were missing, like some kind of bronchitis or a missed pulmonary embolism at the very subsegmental level, or something lower, right? Yeah, that you don't see. There was other things that could have been going on, but overall I was quite reassured, as was the doctor. And it was so strange. So then I was like, okay. And what's interesting is I would still occasionally have the symptoms, but it wasn't associated with panic or any of that. And there was not ever shortness of breath. So we went home. The next day, I had a little bit of those symptoms, but I felt a lot better overall. I was still coughing. And then just the days went by. And by day 14, I was still having cough, fatigue, all of that. But it was just kept getting a little better each day. And now I don't know how many days out I am, but I feel pretty much back to normal. A little fatigue, none of that disequilibrium. And so the whole thing was really freaking mysterious, because how much of this is here? How much of it is the social kind of conditioning of it? How much of it is being a doctor and overthinking all the stuff? How much of it is having done 23andMe and then finding out I have these risks? And if I had not known that, why would I assume that anything was wrong? But instead I have a pre-existing risk for catastrophic badness. So all of it goes in to someone who has medical training to generate this kind of experience, because that's what it was. It was this experience of like, okay, there's this biological thing, whatever the virus is doing. There's a psychological thing of what the fuck am I going to die? And then the social thing of like, oh man, I don't want to like I don't want to misadvise people or like blow this thing off and then have something terrible happen and be a case study for people who know, oh yeah, remember that ZDoc guy? Yeah, he a dumbass didn't like go in when he had a big PE. It's all this kind of social conditioning. And then you look at it and you go, okay, how does this drive our behavior? How does it drive medical costs? Like the kind of, we talk about the worried well, like, and how like media in itself can actually condition people to worry about things that they, like, you know, like there's like a generalized panic over things like chronic Lyme disease and things like that we don't really understand. And people are coming in going, okay, I think I have this. And then there's a lot of testing and so on. And I'm just giving one example, but there's a lot of things, right? And how does it affect things like long COVID? How does it affect, you know? So a few things that came up for me were, okay, yeah, the mind-body thing is one continuum. I still don't know why my O2 sat went down. If you guys have ideas, put them in the comments. Was I actually psychologically changing the O2 sat, or did I have some subtle thing? But it was real. Like, it was documented by the doctor. It wasn't me making it up. But what the hell was that? Because if that wasn't happening, there's no way I would have gone for a CT angio. Because why? Your O2 sat's fine. You're probably just having your typical COVID symptoms. So I wanted to share all this because I know there are people out there who are going through some variant of this during this summer surge of COVID, or have been through it, or have loved ones who are going through it. And like me, a doctor who online talks about this all the time in a very detached, objective way, can experience this with COVID. And to some degree, you know, I've been in the camp that's like COVID has become another cold. It's another part of our circulating, which it is. And to an extent, that is what happened to me, right? It's like if I've had colds that are worse, that feel worse than this, but they don't have the same biopsychosocial baggage that COVID has developed over, you know, this pandemic, which, and some of it's quite warranted. Early in the pandemic, people were dying of ARDS, mostly elderly people with pre-existing conditions like diabetes, but still some young people, it would happen to some young people. And blood clots were a big thing. I had a doctor on my show who was roughly my age when he got COVID. He's an ER doc. You can go back and see that episode. It was about a virtual reality piece on COVID. And his first symptom really was a big life-threatening pulmonary embolism. And he had no other pre-existing conditions. So you have this sort of bias towards these things happening. Now, some people have a bias where this thing is a total joke and it doesn't exist and it's a plandemic and so on, in which case they're, you know, biased in the opposite direction. And bad things can happen in that way too, because when serious stuff happens, biologically, they're socially and psychologically conditioned to ignore it. So we see that as well. So all of this is to say is humans are these vibrating interactions. It's almost a field of their biology, their psychology, their social connections, and it's all one happening. And the more honest we are about our own experiences and then relating to others and saying, okay, yeah, no, I can actually see here, okay, where the panic was and where, oh, there was some shame, humiliation, fear. Oh, there is this. It actually makes it much lighter and also better, I think, for others who are going through the same thing. So weigh in the comments. Tell me if you think I'm crazy. Tell me if you think I've misdiagnosed something. Tell me if you think I'm being irresponsible and not doing something or doing too much. People in the last video, some of the comments that were interesting, there were so many great comments. Really wonderful, actually, comment section. I was very surprised because I expected it to be full of either anti-vaxxers or pro-vaxxers or people on extremes, but really it was very alt-middle. It was very like nuanced. There are a few people who were complaining that I put a mask on my daughter when I drove her back from Berkeley in the car. And they were like, why would you do that? And it's like, because she's sick and I'm not. And we're in an enclosed space. And I only had one mask. So, because I don't have a shit ton of masks laying around. And so she got to wear the mask and she was fine with it. When people are sick, it's generally courtesy to put a mask on instead of coughing all over everyone. If we did more of that, probably, although we'd have to study it directly, we'd have less spread of respiratory viruses. Although, again, in practice, the way people wear masks, the way they touch faces and surfaces and stuff makes it much more complex than masks work or masks don't work, right? And the type of mask, all of it becomes very, very complex. So there isn't just an on-off right answer. Now, when she came into the house, she wasn't wearing a mask at all. and was coughing everywhere, touching everything. And my youngest daughter and my wife did not get sick. So is that because they didn't get as much of an inoculum being in the car or close to my daughter? Did they just get lucky? Have they had COVID before and didn't know it? We all have the same basic vaccination status, which was our last vaccines were in 2021. So who knows, right? It's interesting. Leave in the comments your own experience with any of the weird stuff that happens like this. If you had to seek medical attention, if you had a complication, because I want to hear about it. And it's a really great repository of this experience and this snapshot in time in the COVID unfolding. All right, I love you. If you would like to join our supporter tribe, if you'd like to be a part of that group, we talk a lot about all these things, but also meditation, awakening, that kind of stuff. There's a link in the description where you can do all those things. Hit like or dislike, leave a comment. It helps the algorithm. I love you guys. And we're out. And notice I'm not coughing. Isn't that nice? All right. Hope everyone out there who's sick feels better soon. And peace.